Hello fellow cyborgs and welcome to my wrap-up of the Springathon Readathon. Springathon was hosted by Natalie and Emma and it ran from the 4th to the 17th of May 2020. It challenged you to read more nature nonfiction, but also had prompts that could accommodate some fiction reads as well. In no particular order, let me go through the books that I finished. I listened to the audiobook of The Invention of Nature by Andrea Wolf, which is a biography of Alexander von Humboldt. He was an 18th and 19th century naturalist, I suppose you could say. He is responsible for a lot of the scientific concepts that we now take for granted, including the fact that the plants that grow in different areas depend a lot upon altitude as well as latitude. He also introduced the concept of nature being a web where the consequences of one animal or one species or one plant will have consequences for the other species in that same ecosystem. He was also really renowned for his nature writing being both scientific and poetic. He inspired a lot of different nature writers, including Henry David Thoreau of Walden fame. He also inspired Simón Bolívar, Goethe, Charles Darwin, among others. He was a very influential man of his time who has since been lost to time. I don't think that my listening experience to this audiobook was as attentive as it could have been. I do think that I missed out on some things. However, though I enjoyed learning about the different people that were influenced by Humboldt, we got many biographies of all of the people I've mentioned and then some. Sometimes the organization of this book was a little scattered, and perhaps that factored into my not having absorbed as much as I was hoping to have. Overall, though, I enjoyed this, and I did download on my Kindle for free 2 of von Humboldt's works, so we'll see when or if I eventually get to those, but I was motivated enough learning about him to see if I wanted to try some of his work. I gave this 3 out of 5 stars. For the animal prompt, I read The Bear and the Nightingale by Catherine Arden along with M.A. Anders. We buddy read it together, she reread it, whereas I was reading it for the first time. There's a lot of hype surrounding this book on BookTube, and I was really worried about that when I went into it. I was simultaneously convinced that I would love this and also convinced that I would not enjoy it based upon the hype. At the end of the day, I gave this 3 out of 5 stars. The main reason for that is at the end of this book, I found that I didn't particularly have an emotional connection with any of the characters I had been following. However, there are many things that this book does right. I really enjoyed the medieval Russian setting. It was fascinating to learn about a time period and a culture that I had no experience with before. I also really loved the spirits that we get to know a little bit more about and the magical world. Those were definitely my favorite parts, and I'm excited to learn more in the follow-up books. The characterization was succinct and snappy. You were given just enough from a character to understand who they were without having it being overly descriptive or overly sentimental. I enjoyed how, though there were quote-unquote good guys and bad guys, they were all completely gray, ambiguous people. Even the most unlikable characters had some amount of sympathy around them. I enjoyed the horses in this book, who had quite a number of personalities. At times, this got pretty horrific and scary, and I enjoyed that she went there without being over the top, but that these action sequences really had an amount of terror to them. I also enjoyed the relatively short chapters. It kept me reading really easily. So even though I gave this 3 out of 5 stars, which is not a stellar star rating, I will 100% be finishing this trilogy this year. I just have to get around to getting the 2 other books. For the bird prompt, I finished Autobahns Elephant by Duff Hart Davis. This is a biography of John James Audubon, who was well known for his Birds of America series. He is well known for having painted all of the species of North American birds in full life size. Not many copies of his Birds of America survive, and they are very, very valuable. This is a overall biography of Audubon, but specifically it looks at his time spent mostly in England trying to get his book funded. He needed to get subscribers who were eager to see these prints and get a final edition of the book in order for him to have the capital to actually start creating the engravings. I really appreciated that this also, though, went to his time before this and his time after this part of his life. I enjoyed the full color illustrations in here and the fact that there isn't actually a lot of text, so if you want to know more about Audubon but you don't want to read a 600-page biography, this is a good place to start. However, I was disturbed to realize that Audubon killed the animals that he painted. He wasn't a nature artist as well as a conservationist. That was kind of shocking, even though I realized after I was shocked that I shouldn't be surprised. A lot of the early scientists and nature scientists didn't have the same sort of reverence for animals as we do now. I also found him to be a little bit disingenuous. He spent a lot of time away from his family in England trying to get his book published and then traveling through the backwoods of America trying to paint more bird species. Though in his journals and letters, he was constantly writing about how he missed his family. And somehow I just kept thinking, well, while you could be with them, but for one reason or another, legitimate or not, you are choosing not to be with them. So needless to say, I don't respect Autobahn more as a person after reading this, but it's not like I think he's a monster or anything. At the end of the day, I'm glad I read this, but I'm not sure I'm going to be keeping it on my shelves. 3 out of 5 stars. For the plant prompt, I reread A Monster Calls by Patrick Ness, based off of an idea by Siobhan Dowd and illustrated by Jim Kay. I loved this. I loved it when I first read it, and I love it now. This made me cry. This made me ugly cry that I had to like hide in my backyard so people didn't get scared. This is a story about grief. And oh, I forgot to mention there's a talking yew tree. That's the titular monster, and that's why I applied it to plant. And this monster is making nightly visits to Connor, whose mother is dying of cancer. But this is truly a book about grief and dealing with grief and the different expressions of grief. This rereading experience, I really focused on the adults in his life and which adults did him the most disservice. My opinion on that changed on this reread. This is definitely a beautiful book. The illustrations are also quite stunning. They're scratchy and in black and white, but they pervade the story, and there are even some full page spreads. I don't know why you would want to read A Monster Calls and not have those beautiful illustrations to look at the same time. So this was definitely a lovely rereading experience, and this is one of my favorite books of all time. For the water prompt, I reread The Riverbank, a sequel to The Wind in the Willows by Kij Johnson. This picks up right after the events in The Wind in the Willows, but adds 2 new characters to our story, Beryl the Mole and the Rabbit. Unfortunately, my opinions of this book did not change upon rereading. Originally, I thought that the tone of this story, the writing style itself, was neither reminiscent of Kij Johnson nor Kenneth Grahame, who originally wrote The Wind in the Willows. At the end, there's an author's note where she says she wanted to explore this story and bring women into it, and how she knows that this was an imperfect sequel. And while I respect her desire to actually add women into the world of The Wind in the Willows, Beryl the Mole seemed like a wish fulfillment character who always knew the right thing to do and the right thing to say. The Rabbit was a little more interesting, but overall, though this became a more sexually equal sequel to The Wind in the Willows, there was still so much about class snobbishness that really wasn't my favorite. Also, throughout this book, our original character Mole is pouting and sulking the whole time, which is just not the Moley I know and love, and it just definitely makes this a bit of a downer. So my opinions on this book didn't change, but my enjoyment did, and I gave this 2 out of 5 stars instead of the initial 3. I will be unhauling this book. Unfortunate because it is a really pretty edition and I really like the concept, but it's just not what I want it to be. For the travel prompt, I reread Ghostland by Colin Dickey. The first time I read this book, I was really turned off by it. I ended up giving it 3 out of 5 stars, but I remember being really irritated while reading it. And I think the main reason is because of the foreword or the author's note at the beginning. The first thing you read in this book is, "This book is not about the truth or falsity of any claims of ghosts." I suppose this is true because Ghostland is not about whether or not ghosts exist. However, claims of ghosts I would label as a ghost story. And this book does, over and over again, disprove ghost stories. That's not Dickey's main intention, but it happens over and over again. What this really is about is Dickey is looking at why we tell certain ghost stories in certain places. What do these ghost stories say about American culture, about what Americans want to tell one another and what Americans want to hide from one another? So for instance, there's a section on Richmond, Virginia, which had a huge, thriving slave market when slavery was still legal in America. And yet, in this incredibly haunted town, there are 0 black ghosts. Why is that? I got a lot more out of this upon rereading. Since I knew what it was actually trying to do, and I wasn't just immediately having my hackles up because he told me he wasn't going to do something that he then immediately did, I found it fascinating to think about why we tell the stories that we do and why we tell them the way that we tell them. This goes into a lot of different isms that intersect with these ghost stories. It goes into the history of America and the different places as relate to these ghost stories. It's really, really interesting. The first time I read this, I think I also said that it was too academic. I didn't think that upon rereading. One gripe I still have, though, is that this spoils the plot twists of Stephen King's Pet Sematary and Charlotte Bronte's Jane Eyre without purpose. I don't know why this had to be in there, but if you haven't read either of those books and you want to, don't read this first. But apart from that, I got a lot more out of this and boosted up my rating from 3 to 4 stars. I'm really glad I reread this. I also had plans to reread Roseanne Alexander's Waterfalls of Stars, My 10 Years on the Island of Skomer. However, I didn't make it all the way through this. I stopped at page 149. By the time I was reading this, I was a little burnt out from the readathon, but also I have really mixed feelings about this book. I really enjoy what it's writing about and how it's written, but I find it very difficult to pick this up and read it for more than 10 or 15 minutes in a go. Maybe it's because the font is so small. Maybe it's because the chapters aren't separated by little like icons into different sections. Maybe it's because each chapter flows almost dreamlike from one idea to the next. I can't really put my finger on it, but as much as I really enjoy this book, it's a hard read, so I decided to not finish this for now, but I'm not changing my star rating. I'm still leaving this at a 4 out of 5 star rating, but that might change in the future if I try to reread this again and have similar issues. This is not a problem that has come up with any other book, really. If you have any opinions on the matter, let me know. A couple of surprise reads came up though. I listened to the audiobook of HS4 Hawk by Helen MacDonald. This is another very popular nature nonfiction on BookTube. I remember hearing a lot of people thought it was boring, but perhaps I misremembering. This is part memoir of MacDonald training a goshawk Mabel, part memoir about her dealing with the grief over the death of her father, and part biography of T.H. White and his falconry. That third part was probably my favorite. It was such a surprise, and I really love when I'm reading a nonfiction and get a little mini nonfiction within it that somehow makes sense to be there. Also, having literary references in nonfiction is always going to be a plus side for me. MacDonald herself narrates the audiobook, and she did an excellent job. I highly recommend listening to this if you're interested. Though I have mixed feelings about the idea of falconry in itself, I think MacDonald did a really fair job of representing the reality of it, the history of it, and some of its pitfalls. Overall, this was such a pleasant surprise, and I gave it 4 out of 5 stars. I might have to buy my own physical copy, especially if it's this really beautiful edition. Another surprise was The Making of the African Queen, or How I Went to Africa with Bogart Bacall in Houston and Almost Lost My Mind by Katharine Hepburn. I recently rewatched The African Queen, and my friend had this on her shelves and let me borrow it. This is a very slight memoir of Katharine Hepburn's experiences in Africa during the making of The African Queen. The writing style was very strange and kind of hard to get into. It's almost as though she's sitting in front of you talking to you with the same sorts of pauses and mismatched thoughts as would naturally happen, but that you rarely find in published works. I didn't get that much more information out of here than I did watching a documentary about the making of The African Queen, which was a little unfortunate, but it was interesting to hear about her experiences in Africa, and this would, I think, probably count for the travel part of Springathon. It also had some lovely photographs with absolutely adorable photograph captions, so this was a lovely few hours. I gave it 3 out of 5 stars. So I would say that my Springathon was a success. I had a lot of fun reading these books, getting some of those rereads off of my shelf, and discovering some new surprises. Please let me know in the comments down below your favorite book of Springathon, and maybe even your least favorite if you'd like to share that as well. Thank you for watching, and until next time, continue to be lovely. For the bird prompt, I read Autobahns Elephant as well as a conservationist.